Hey guys, Saf here with another Raid Shadow Legends video. Today I want to do a bit of a math breakdown understanding the changes that have happened to Baron's skills. When I first saw the changes, I was a little bit negative. I thought they'd actually made him worse. But now that I've done the math, I don't think it is as bad as I thought. And actually I think he's probably better purely because I overlooked some of the skill cooldown changes. So let's just break down kind of what they have changed first so we have that all fresh in our minds. They removed basically the secret skill component. So the A1 and the A2 is exactly the same thing as it was before, but now it doesn't have a different varying chance to activate Skypiercer. Skypiercer used to be a secret skill that you can only activate based on attacking a target, which is why he was kind of meh for a lot of arena setting. This skill used to hit extremely hard, but you could never actually unlock it. It's a bit like Mortu Macabre's Peril. When you unlock it, it's awesome. The benefit with Mortu Macabre is it happens when he gets attacked. So that is more likely to happen more often than taking turns on Baron. So that's why that's slightly more relevant and better than Baron ever was. The A3 then was reduced in cooldown by 1. And I actually think that's a massive change because that turns it from a sort of 4-turn cooldown when booked to a 3-turn cooldown. And this is like Turvold's ability. The more buffs you have on the champion, the harder he's going to hit. I didn't actually put much value into that change, but actually it's huge. It's basically far more uptime on his hardest hitting ability if you're using him in places like Clan Boss or other areas of the game. The other cool thing to note is his A1 has this excess damage effect where any enemies with excess damage, so more damage than actually is needed to kill the enemy, that's then sort of transferred onto all other enemies and multiplied again. Imagine Trunda's A2, it's a little bit like that, where the secondary damage that she deals on an AoE is multiplied again. So you can actually get double the amount of crit damage on this A1. It's what makes him actually better for Arena now because you get a really strong single nuke, and then if there's anyone that does live and you can finish them off, you're going to do a sort of a secondary AoE via that kind of excess damage. He also has a big aura for all battles. Great base defense is Void, and that is pretty strong. What did they change on Skypiercer? So some of the negatives here, it's now got a cooldown. So it's a one hit wonder. Things like reaction are going to be a problem for this guy. Stone Skin is going to be a problem for this guy. Once he does his Skypiercer, it's on cooldown. Where before you could go A3, unlock it, do Skypiercer, then go back to the A2, oh, it unlocked again, go do Skypiercer again. You could get more Skypiercer uptime because it didn't have a cooldown and it was only dependent on you unlocking it. It's now dependent on a cooldown. The good thing is it doesn't require books, so they've kept that the same. However, it now deals 50% ignore defense, not 100% ignore defense. Before, it would completely ignore defense. Now it will not. I have got in this video some comparisons of a Clan Boss team that I ran in his old build before and after this change, so we can see kind of the difference. Building this champion has changed quite a lot as well. And I'm going to talk about that in terms of the decisions you now need to change and make when you're building this champion versus how you did it before the change. They also boosted his base speed up by 10, so it went from 90 to 100. That's actually quite a big change as well. It means that you can actually build some decent speed on him without having to index much more heavily into speed substats. So that's very good change. So that's what they did to Baron. Now, the concerns that I had was Skypiercer going from 100% to 50%, that kind of reduces his value there because 100% is much stronger than 50% naturally, and you can't get back to 100% unless you're relying on Helm Smasher. The other thing I obviously didn't like was it's a cooldown now, which meant I couldn't have it up in PvE constantly, specifically for Clan Boss when I was testing it. That's the two concerns I had, but I think actually now upon reflection, those were not correct concerns because of where you use him. So let's talk about how you build Baron now versus before. When his kit was released before, you didn't need accuracy, you didn't need ignore defense, so Savage and Lethal wasn't needed. You didn't need Helm Smasher, so your mastery setups in your equipment was completely different. The good thing is you still don't need accuracy. This is the only debuff that he places, and he places it as a guaranteed. The wording here is different. It's a special, unique type of effect. This is one of the only debuffs that can be placed with a block debuffs on a target. It doesn't seem to be able to get past Stone Skin, but if a champion or a character has block debuffs, he will still place that decreased defense even if that buff is up. It's one of the few, I think the only ability in the game that can do that. So that's what they mean by guaranteed. I need to test it further on things like the Fire Knight shield as to whether or not that can apply through the Fire Knight shield. Some people says it does, some people says it doesn't. I haven't really truly tested it myself. Actually, let's go and quickly test that now. So we're at the Fire Knight shield here. What we want to see is, can we place the decreased defense through this shield counter? No. So the Fire Knight shield will block it as well, but block debuffs, that buff on its own, that will be fine. So how do we need to change the gearing? Well, before we would basically have Masteries where we would pick Flawless Execution. And you can see I kind of haven't really changed my Masteries here since the last time. I picked Flawless Execution. Why? Because I don't need any Ignore Defense. So Helm Smasher is out. And normally I'm not using him in a PvE setting, so I want to deal more damage. Flawless Execution will give me that. You could technically not pick a capstone on offense and go for more things like resist if you really want to, but to be honest, he doesn't need accuracy. He doesn't really want to get turn meter necessarily. The other things in there are not so great, and you'd probably be better off just taking 20% more crit damage, for a better word. The other things you need to take into account now is this is not 100% ignore defense, so you need savage and lethal if you want to be using him in arena, where before you would prioritize stats. And this is kind of the same in every other area of the game as well. If you were using this ability here to just blow through targets, he didn't need the savage and lethal set, so he could prioritize things. So I had to completely rebuild my Baron from my before and after tests. That did require a remastery, and that did require a complete kind of re-optimization. So if you've had your Baron lying around, that's the first thing I would 100% do, is rebuild him into Savage and Cruel. You want to be able to increase the value of this ignore defense, and we're going to look at how that matters in a little bit. So let's do some math here, and let's take a look at what his damaging abilities used to be in terms of his overall damage output on things like Clan Boss, and also his one-hit wonder on Skypiercer, what it was before. And then we're going to do a math to actually see what it now will hit for and how it actually compares after the update. So this is kind of like my own internal indexing of champion damaging abilities. It sets an index for every single champion, a build based on their base stats, books included, but things such as critical damage and things other than that are not included. And what we're doing here is we're kind of looking at what is the overall kit damage. You know, we do have some champions in the game that have really, really hard hitting abilities, but they're on a long cooldown. So when you're in sort of a Clan Boss scenario, a Hydra scenario, you're looking at kind of DPS, damage per second, or damage per skill, for a better word, rather than actually just like the one hit, how hard does one champion hit in one go. And we can see Baron used to sit at around about number 3 here on his skill rotations, because effectively that A4 could be up all of the time nearly. As long as you could activate it and unlock it, every other ability would be that Skypiercer, and that will deal kind of like a fixed, static, guaranteed type of number because it's 100% ignore defense. However, that will obviously change, but just to put that into context, obviously Jintoro has the highest overall because of his 5-hitter. Then we get Ninja. This doesn't include the HP burn debuff, so probably when you factor that in, Ninja is actually likely stronger than Jintoro. Then we get Val. His passive stacks up over the duration of the Clan Boss, and he does have low cooldowns. And then we have Alika because she A1 double hits. So you can see what we're doing here is we're kind of factoring all this in. I think the buff count on Turvold and Baron, his A3, is based on, I think, 5 or 3 buffs. I cannot remember which one it is, but it is not based on 10, because actually trying to get 10 buffs in a Clan Boss scenario is quite hard unless you're running almost like that kind of double Demitha, single Turvold, and just buff him to infinity and beyond kind of team. But that's what his overall kind of per skill cooldown damage would be. It puts him at number 3. Let's take a look at some of the actual on-hit abilities. So in this chart, we're basically looking at every champion who has an AoE ability in the game and then indexing them from the hardest hitting to the lowest hitting. Now, Calvalax is in a bit of a weird situation. We can ignore him essentially because his A2, his AoE does enemy max HP, so I'm still trying to work out the correct way to calculate that because it is based on poisons and a bunch of other facilities here. However, we can see the Baron firmly on a high arena settings. This is 4,000 defense. This sits at 54,933 before the change to his ability, so pure damage. You can see that's why Skypiercer was considered to be one of the hardest hitting abilities in the game, but not usable because you couldn't activate it. If you did, he annihilated everyone in the game because it was so strong. It doesn't matter what defense you're running, unless you're running damage multiplication decrease effects such as strengthen, or any sort of passives, he's going to blow through your team pretty comfortably. We do see Ruel sits up here as well at 47,000, and Hefrak, the double hits. These are assuming like optimal conditions. So Ruel has his hexes out, Hefrak double hits. Thea, I think, is running with 4 hex debuffs out. We've got Robar is running with a control CC effect in the fight. Houndspawn has got a freeze out there. All of these things are factored in, and we can see that Baron sat on the high defense setting at the top of the roost. Now, if we change this and say like we put a debuff out there on a 4,000 defense target, that moves their defense down to around about 1,200. And that's around about the same thing as a clan boss. And that is where this base booked value comes in. So if you apply a debuff out there, he falls down the rankings quite a bit. We now see that Ruel goes up considerably. Thea the Tomb Angel goes up considerably. Hefrak goes up considerably. You can't really increase Baron's number any higher because he's already dealing pure damage. We're actually reducing Ruel's damage down because the damage reduction percentage on enemies, because they have defense, is pulling that number down, where it doesn't with Baron. Baron here then starts falling down. We actually see Delver is hitting pretty hard here. That's one of the epics that was changed. It'd be interesting to see that. I think I'm going to be doing a guide on it soon. But you can quite clearly see then that this changes. He was still one of the strongest hard-hitting abilities, but now he's actually quite a bit different to someone like a Trunder and someone like a Hefrak. And of course, those champions didn't require an unlock of an ability. So on this list then, I've got all the single target abilities in the game, ranked via my own index again. We can see Jintoro naturally will sit right at the top because of the power of his A3. We're on the 15-20 defense marker here, which would be kind of like what a high defense target would be if you had that debuff out there. So Richthof hits pretty hard because his poisons are out there. We've got some crazy unique champions like Shamael. It's pretty easy to activate. Again, you can see Shamael's damage doesn't really change much here because it assumes you're going to have the 3 buffs up, which is quite easy to activate. So he's going to have kind of like the same damage as if you're hitting a 6,000 defense target, a 2,000 defense target. He ignores 100% defense. Franox, one of the new ones, comes in, hits really hard. I'm looking forward to actually testing that. I've pulled that champion. But we can see Baron doesn't really make it up into any of the top 10 lists here. There's a lot of epics that hit a lot harder than Baron. We have to go quite far down to actually find Baron's first ability. There's Turvold's A1. There's Baron's A2. There's his guaranteed debuff. That's at 47,000. And there's Baron's A3 as well. That's at 45,000. So you can see he wasn't a massive single target hitter. He was all about his Skypiercer. So how has this changed now? I did a test basically on Clan Boss where I ran him in my sort of Myth Fu without Fu. Mythfulus, I haven't figured out a name for it yet. My typical clan boss team, he was in the 5th slot as DPS, and I ran that through to see how much damage he could do. He was fully booked. He was in a pretty good build. I'd say it was about 6,000 attack, 250% crit damage while I ran it. And this is the results I had before the update. So as I said, I was running him in a pretty good build. This is what I had him in: 6,000 attack, 258% crit damage at the speed required to be able to run in that team. And it was around about, we had one cruel set in there, so 5% ignore defense on that target. The nice thing about the all rotation was, as I said, if you got lucky and you unlocked that ability all the time, you could run a lot more Skypiercers. And the damage we basically got out of this build, specifically before the buff, was as follows. And this was the damage we actually got in that build. It ran on, I think, Void Affinity for neutrality. Obviously, you can't strong or weak hit, but it's good always to test it on Void so you get like a clean footing across the team. He did about 30.4 million damage. Now, obviously, there was variability. They could have gone higher, it could have gone lower. We know there's a 10% range, and especially with Baron, the more activations he gets to the Skypiercer, the better. But that's kind of where he was doing before. And then I ran the same exact build. I had to tweak it a little bit, obviously, because he had more base speed, just to adjust his speed to the right setting. And this is the result we got after the change. So we got 32.76 million. So the good news is, after this update, based on my test just in this one scenario, again, this was on a neutral affinity for Baron, so he wasn't gaining a strong or weak. His Void Affinity can't. He did more damage, and this is because I didn't really attribute the uptime of his A3. It's gone to a 3-turn cooldown, and that A3, when you get in a clan boss setting where you can get a few more buffs out on him, is extremely powerful. It is a Turvold-esque damaging ability, and it was just on a longer cooldown. Now it's not. Turvold obviously was on a 3-turn cooldown with an extra turn, so he was doing that Juggernaut ability far more often. So how does this look then in terms of the math? Where are his numbers after the update? So the important thing to note is none of the multipliers themselves were changed in the abilities. The only thing that was changed was the cooldown on Skypiercer, the cooldown on the A3, and the ignore defense value that was placed on the A3. One of the things I actually adapted in our index that we use to grade all the champions as a result of this change, and from conversations with Senti as well, who does a lot of different evaluations and maths in the community, was that we actually needed to include in these builds Savage and Cruel, or basically Lethal and Cruel, the ignore defense components in the actual base index. Before update 6, we actually didn't include any artifact sets when we were evaluating damage because we felt they were the same on every champion. However, now that we have more of these conditional based champions that do certain amounts of ignore defense, the actual damage gain from Savage and Cruel is actually different. It's not linear. Someone like Baron is going to gain a lot more damage out of Savage and Cruel as a set than someone like Trunder, which doesn't ignore defense. I did a video this week on ignoring defense mechanics and how damage reduction works. There's a section there where we talk about ignore defense, and you can see how this is having an impact. So these indexes now include the assumption that you're going to build Savage and Cruel on your champion so that they can be compared fairly. Ruel would sit on 30% ignore defense for his abilities. Baron is going to sit on 80% for his Skypiercer, and that's an important distinction. So let's take a look at this then. We can see that none of the other champions have obviously changed because we haven't looked at those, but Baron is no longer at number 3. Turvold has taken its place, and Baron now falls down here below Tormentor of all champions. It's actually quite surprising when you do this math, when you find some interesting champions that you would never have thought about for damage. Someone like Gory is coming in like the overall like kit damage. I'm pretty sure that requires a counterattack from Freeze, which obviously the clan boss can't do, and various other things. But just as a kind of example there, we've got, Rorik Wormbane. He's another champion that has that A3 that has an ignore defense component. That's now a lot stronger in this index because effectively we've added in the Lethal and Savage, and it's going to give him more value over someone who didn't have conditional ignore defense. Baron has lost quite a lot because effectively we've put a 4-turn cooldown on his Skypiercer, so you can't have it up all the time. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to translate poorly in the game, because obviously before, what we weren't factoring when we had this number was we were assuming it would go A3 Skypiercer, A2 Skypiercer, A1 Skypiercer, A3. We weren't really factoring in the averages in terms of can it unlock. So that would have been pulling that number down in real terms. However, here we can see now in a much more accurate manner how much overall damage his kit does. And it's still pretty good. It's still like top 20, top 30, but it's not as good as it was. So that's a bit of a disappointment, but actually I don't think in real terms it's actually going to make a big difference. In terms of his AoE ability, now it does change a little bit. So Baron's number before was around about 54,000. He now drops down to 46,000. So the Skypiercer ability has had a nerf in damage. It hits less, but in real terms, because you don't have to unlock it, it's more activatable, it's more relevant and usable. So we get this kind of conflict in math sometimes where the math tells you it's really strong, but in reality it's not. Ruel is a classic example. Ruel sits on top of every list, but we never see him in the Plat Arena meta because it needs the Hex debuffs. Same as Marinix. If you want it to work well, you need the Hex debuffs, and you cannot rely on that to happen. Baron actually is one of the few champions that requires nothing. He will ignore all shields, he will ignore all block damage, he will deal X amount of damage, he will ignore 50% defense. He doesn't require anything other than increased attack to make his damage realistic, whereas Ruel needs a lot of conditions. We need the Hex out there, we need the ability to have that Hex on 4 targets, then we need all the different effects to come in. He needs to take another turn. Baron, you just come in and hit A4 and job done. It's so long as you don't have things like reaction and stone skin in your way. So that's where he sits now. He's obviously still, in terms of an AoE damage dealer for that A4, top 10, top 20 in the game. In terms of where really a lot of the high-end arena players are going to be focused, in high-end Plat Arena, applying decreased defense debuff is near impossible now that we've got all these blessings, stone skin, protection, debuffs, everything else like these things that are in the sort of game now. It's almost impossible to place a debuff. So you're assuming you're going in there and you're going to be facing a 3,000 to 4,000 defense target. Well, Baron will basically deal the same amount of damage as someone like Hefrak. Now, on realistic terms, his hit isn't that strong. However, because it can bypass many mechanics and it doesn't require any setup, it is strong. The Heffrack damage here assumes you're going to hit twice, but that assumes that you're going to be able to take the first hit below 50% to hit twice, which is not happening at high end. So you can effectively halve this damage down to 15,000 or sort of 17,000. The same thing with Ruel. It assumes you're going to hit twice. So if you don't, then Baron is still doing more damage if he only hits once. Same with Thea. It assumes there is 4 hexes out there. But if there are not 4 hexes out there, then Thea the Tomb Angel doesn't do as much damage as Baron. So what you actually end up in a situation here is Baron is the #1 damage dealer in high defense, no debuff scenarios, because he can bypass many of the mechanics. He bypasses Bolster. It does have an issue with Rotus. It's a single hit. But if you've got a situation where you know you're walking into a bolstered team where you know that they probably have protected debuffs and you cannot like place a protected debuff, for a better word, you cannot place decreased defense, Baron will come in and do the job for you. You just have to take into account reaction and stone skin. A lot of the Plat Arena now is negative speed. It's going really, really slow. So that's why Baron is really good. You protect it with a neck rep buff. He kind of gets a chance to do his ability. So that's how his numbers have changed. Technically, they've nerfed his damage. Because of the realistic way you would use the skill, it's a massive buff, because now it's just a straight skill you can use whenever you need. So let's take the Baron for a bit of a spin. What we've basically determined is he is probably the #1 high-end arena nuker in the game, except going into someone like Rotus, because obviously he can't one-shot the Rotus. The Rotus passive will kick in. What you really want to be looking at is for teams that probably are a bit slower, that you can basically remove buffs if you need to for things like Stone Skin. I'm going to be testing it against this team here. This team is a good example. We've got sort of a Cardiel and Necret. Necret's probably in protection set. He has that sheep debuff, so there's a risk that I could get polymorphed. I run a double buff removal step here in case any of these are Stone Skin, just to try and get double the attempts to get rid of Stone Skin. There's a risk there could be reaction as well. But let's see what Baron can do into this team. So what have we got? We have got no Stone Skin, but we do have double block debuffs. Now, the annoying thing with Kimmy is she will remove 1 buff, but she doesn't like picking the right buff. She did that time, which is great. So it means that if Candrathon gets any buffs, now I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be fast enough here, but we can try it. Maybe we are. I'm pretty sure I'm going to get cleansed, and that's annoying. Welcome to the world of Cardiel. But can we actually one-shot sort of Cardiel and Duchess here? Now, Duchess will be built pretty tanky here, and she's got the passive to reduce the damage even further. Can he one-shot? Absolutely. We even saw a Soul Reap come out there, but unfortunately, Candrathon has basically every buff under the damn sun. Now, we can revive again, bring him back alive. Obviously, they had Revive and Death because of Candrathon. We can take him out. Oh, we didn't quite do that. This is actually ideal. So long as we don't kill that Cardiel, that would have been ideal for Baron's A1. Let's just throw this through. Maybe we'll get lucky. They didn't configure the Candrathon correctly. He shouldn't be doing that ability. And now we're in this situation where, to be honest, we probably just want to hit with the A2 because it hits hard enough. We can place block debuffs because it goes through. It's guaranteed. It's one of the few abilities. We're probably going to like lose a bit here because we're getting absolutely smashed. Look, the amount of buffs that are out is absolutely... Oh, we're going again. We can get rid of 1 buff, but it's not looking good. And this is the problem. This is a classic example of the issue with high-end arena. Now, the good thing is we can do that. The question is, do we have any damage in this ability to be able to take someone out? We probably can't pick the Duchess because it's got ally protection. We probably can't pick the thing, so we're probably just better off going and seeing, can we just one-shot this? Probably not, because he hasn't got increased attack. This is a problem with Baron a little bit. He doesn't have anything other than that AoE, and if the team falls apart, he falls apart. That's an example there. I don't know if I can probably run it a little bit different. We probably don't need the double debuff removal, so we could probably, instead of run, then we can probably bring in a Lissandra to try and get ahead of the Cardiel, because that was the issue there. Cardiel did his ability, so we couldn't actually get back round in time. But hopefully we'll be able to steal some turn meter, and that should now give us the opportunity to just go Skypiercer, and there it is for what he's good for. He annihilated that team. There's no revive now. That's a free win. So that is the end of the video. That is the change with Baron. I think overall the change is actually really positive. I think in a PvE setting, you can still use him for that little clever trickery in sort of normal Doom Tower if you're high end and just one-shot everyone with A1. The A3 makes him now the top arena high-end nuker for just purely outputting damage in an easy, convenient way. In terms of blessings, I actually think there could be some value in wave clearing if you have a high Baron crushing rend. If I get more ascendancy on Baron, I will show that off. At the moment at 1 star, it's not good enough. I need it probably to be around about 3 star to actually test the idea out, because I need a little bit more ignore defense. But the idea is if you can get him up to, say, the higher level, you can get to that 100% ignore defense back on the Skypiercer. Can that wave clear in PvE? That would be an interesting test to see. But with that said, guys, that is the end of the video. If you have had your Baron in the vault storage, I hope this convinces you to pull him out and give him a whirl in arena. He is actually quite a lot of fun, especially with that A1 to see how much extra damage you can hit to other targets. Let me know in the comments below if you are now using your Baron, if you've used him in any other areas, or if you found any new ways after his change that I haven't thought about here. But with that said, I will catch you in the next video.